Welcome back to the 5G Manufacturing Forum. We've got a great panel discussion here for you on spectrum allocation for industrial users, and it's a pleasure to introduce our guest moderator, Mr. Chris Pearson, President of 5G Americas. Chris, leave it to you.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you might be in the world. I am honored to be moderating this panel. I have three distinguished panelists. I have Mike O'Reilly, who is the former commissioner at the FCC and now principal at MP O'Reilly Consulting, LLC. I also have Dave Wright, president of Ongo Alliance. And also I have Philip Mardick, group director of Spectrum at Ofcom. Today, we're going to really spend a little time as a panel discussing where we are with Spectrum, what we're doing with Spectrum, how we get to the places with Spectrum, and specifically try to tie in the manufacturing and where that lies in the Spectrum processes, and are they going to be able to use it for 5G and how that involves it. So let's just kind of get right out of the gate. And let me just start out with, people read a lot of headlines. People see a lot of stuff out there about Spectrum, headlines for auctions, or people unhappy or happy about Spectrum auctions, things like that. Are governments doing a good job in identifying and allocating Spectrum for 5G? And then also, where does the use cases for manufacturing and Spectrum come in? So let's just start out. Are governments doing a good job, and why or why not? And maybe former commissioner at the FCC, Mike, I'll let you start on this one.
Well, I think it's diverse. I think that some governments are doing a better job than others, but as a whole, I would say no. Not enough attention is being placed and not enough spectrum is being cleared for 5G services, given the transformational nature of the technology. If you watch the previous panels as I did and saw what's possible here, what's in play already, especially on the manufacturing side, it's not enough is being done, no.
Okay, great. Dave, any thoughts on that? I mean, your association is very involved in a lot of these areas.
Right. So I think in terms of, spectrum for 5G, there's obviously the low band, mid band, high band that we typically talk about, right? And in the US, if we take that as a case study, they did a good job out of the bat getting the high band spectrum out there. There's not a lot of low band to be made available at this point. It's pretty much allocated. Most of the license holders, mobile operators there are, in some what's the word? Some stage of refarming that spectrum for 5G from previous generations of technology. But I think there's a common consensus that this mid-band spectrum really has become the sweet spot for 5G. It's the right blend of both capacity and coverage. You can, find bandwidths of 80 to 100 megahertz per operator to really enable some of the throughputs that you can get with an NR waveform, but also do it with some reasonable coverage. So I think maybe the commissioner's comment about we haven't done a great job. I know that wasn't just limited to the U.S., but I'm assuming some of that was with regards to the mid band, and we have been behind there. It was great when CBRS was opened, and then we had the auctions. That was the first mid band for 5G. Done the C band, some interesting things going on there, and then of course the auction 110 of the 3.45 band as well. So work is going on, more to be done. I would agree with the commissioner in that regard.
All right, Philip, this is a strange question for you because we're basically asking you, our government's doing a good job. Can you explain how you feel? How is Ofcom doing? How are you guys doing?
So being responsible for actually making Spectrum available in my case, I will probably say I'm doing a reasonable job. And to be honest, you need to, I think as others have said, you need to recognize the different demands. So for me, it's actually really important that I have Spectrum available for national coverage to give 5G for everyone. You can walk around with your mobile phone, you can do it, mobile operators, whatever it happens to be. But also I think for enterprises in manufacturing and other areas, you need to make Spectrum available for them at the point they need it. So local Spectrum, so they don't need big national bands to do it, but they need the same sort of things that have equipment in them with the ecosystem driving to be able to have it. So in our case, I've made Spectrum available for them in high band at 26 gigahertz, often called 24 or 28 in the US, depends, but a similar sort of thing. At 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz, where I've made it available as well, shares with other things, but it's available at local level. And then I've made other Spectrum available for mobile operators, and people are rolling it out, doing their stuff with both mid-band and others. So in different places and different parts of the world, it means the emphasis. But I think it's a really important thing we need to think about as we go forward. As Mike said, Actually, it's transformational in places. People are using it for digitalizing different parts of the economy, not just using their mobile phones. And we need to make sure that people can get access, whether they have it for themselves or have it for some integrator or some mobile operator providing the service. You just got to make sure the tools are available for everybody.
So you're actually making specific allocations then for certain industries, is that correct?
No, not particular allocations of particular industries. I'm making some spectrum available on local licenses. So,
Okay.
for example, in the US, you use CBRS, and which is done in different ways.
Right.
Here, what we've effectively done, and in other parts of Europe and other parts of the world, I've got bits of spectrum. I say I can't make it available nationally because actually I've got other services using it, but I can make it available locally.
Okay.
So if you've got a port, if you've got a factory, you come and ask us for the spectrum at that particular point for the amount you need to enable you to do what you want. If, however, you feel that you want to go to a mobile operator and get them to do it through a different way, then that's up to you. But that's for the market to decide, not for the regulator to determine how you should do your business.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll ask Dave then, about CBRS. Where do you see CBRS fitting into the 5G use cases for manufacturing and so forth, and private enterprise? You see that really as an avenue for CBRS, or are you going to need more spectrum with that?
Yeah, well, I appreciated the point that Philip just made about making spectrum available for a variety of players on a local basis, and I think that's really what CBRS is accomplishing as well. So
Right.
when we talk about manufacturing and industrial uses, we were talking actually before the panel began about the amount of activity in the FCC proceeding from those types of players. So, we had different ports, logistics companies, agricultural manufacturers, automotive manufacturers, as well as energy companies and the like, all weighing in, when the commission was debating what the ultimate license rules would be, particularly around the PAL licenses. So in CBRS, we have 2 new tiers of commercial service in addition to the incumbent operations, which continue. Those 2 new commercial tiers, one has got protected spectrum rights at the PAL tier, and then one is essentially opportunistic. When the spectrum is available, you can make use of it, or however much is available at a particular location. So I think depending on the different vertical sector within industrial or manufacturing, some of them felt like they needed the assurance of a PAL license, and so they went and went through the auction process, obtained the licenses there. Others felt that were remote factories, something where there's not a lot of contention for spectrum, the GAA tier would work perfectly fine for them. But I think again, look at the PAL auction results, and we had a number of energy companies, logistics companies, again, manufacturing, agricultural, obtained licenses through that auction process. So I think it speaks to the wisdom of the commission's approach there.
Yeah, and speaking of the wisdom of the commission, I'm going to ask Mike. I never know. Should I say Commissioner O'Reilly when I speak to you, or should I just say Mike?
Mike's just great.
Okay, so you heard a lot, from what Dave was saying about kind of what use cases and CBRS and you were really a part of all of this. I mean, you lived it, breathed it every day. What do you think about what in the U.S. I guess take that mode of you guys when you were there moved a lot of spectrum along, progressed it, I should say, and identified it, allocated. What do you think about the processes and what you did, and some of the things that are, where we're at today with manufacturing or CBRS? Just give us your general thoughts. You were part of it.
Well, look at it, and Philip and I talked about their approach in terms of I call it micro localized, and didn't exactly agree, but I certainly appreciated what they were doing in the UK. But from my perspective, in a much different seat than last year, CBRS has been a smashing success. It's still early in the process, but it's been wonderful to see private LTE and different manufacturing cases, all these things happening that we envisioned it was possible with the right formulation of the license equation, with enough spectrum, and now we look for more spectrum potentially for this shared environment. So I think it's really been done what it was expected. I didn't start this. It was started long before I got to the commission, and I got to lead it to the last, I got the last 10 yards and in the touchdown, and took it across the goal line. So success is, credit to a lot of people, and also to the industry who's really taken advantage of it based by different business models and different options and what they wanted to do. Really exciting to hear what's happening on the manufacturing side, how it's changing the industrialization of plants and factories, and also the autonomization of different technologies. Really exciting to see how spectrum and certainly CBRS is really changing the equation.
When you were at the commission, through the processes, was there ever any consideration for, you see some countries throughout the world thinking about, well, maybe we should have 5G spectrum specific to an industry, whether it's the auto industry or for manufacturing, or maybe the power industry for power, they want to be part of the process. So was there any thought, or what are your thoughts on that? Maybe that's a better question.
Yeah, I mean, there was consideration. It's been done in the U.S. before, and we have lived through some of that mess and some of the problems with refarming or reallocating some of the spectrum that previously was held by some of these users for particular cases. You think of like what's happened in 6 gigahertz or something like that. So there are instances where it was previously tried, and that's why we've moved away as an industry. We've really moved away from allocation for any particular purpose and made really flexible licenses, tried to give as much bandwidth as possible. The difficulty to your first question is, in the U.S. Certainly, we have C-band coming online, but problems with that, in the immediate. You got 3, 4, 5 auctions still, getting ready to conclude at some point, I'm sure. And then after that, it becomes a much more difficult story. Where's the next band coming from? How is that pipeline happening? And that's what I've been spending my time on. What's the next in play? I've certainly talked about the lower 3 gigahertz and spent years trying to advocate. And I think we're almost there if I look at what's happening in infrastructure legislation that might pass the U.S. Congress soon.
Yeah, I was going to ask Philip a question, but since you brought the elephant in the room, you said, "Oh, there's a few problems there." I think you said, "Okay, kind of give us your synopsis in a 2 or 3 minutes or less. What happened with C-band, and why are we where we are?" I mean, I think a few people in the audience might know about it, but this is the idea. Radio altimeters, basically in flying aircraft, and the C-band auction, which raised records. But kind of give us your viewpoint, maybe a quick summary and your viewpoint.
Well, look at the C-band auction and getting it to where it was took a lot of different efforts and a lot of twists and turns. This was one smaller conversation that was really uncooked at the time. The aviation industry, their representatives came before the commission and said, "Hey, we think there's some potential interference to our altimeter at 4.2 to 4.4. Previously we didn't have a problem with the satellite industry being there, but since they're moving out and moving up the band, then we think we have problems and we need a guard band." And they put up the number of 500 megahertz. And I said, "Well, that's probably not going to be in the case. Do you have any data to back this up?" "No, we don't exactly, but we think there might be a problem." And so it was really an uncooked presentation. And I think the commission really went out of its way, certainly I did, to try and address as best we could, while recognizing the problem and the harms that they were talking about really weren't presented. And so to me, it's asked and answered. The commission, had a guard band of 200 plus another 220 megahertz, plus, where the satellite guys are going to live, plus, we did some extra, industry coordination to try and set up the process where they could talk through if there were actually some physical, evidence to present. And we see this, worldwide, where altimeters operate right next to this band, and we haven't had any problems in 40 to 50 countries. So I'm really, a suspect on what's happening. The political fight that has just blown out in the last 2 weeks, where the FAA has come forward and said, absent someone fixing this, there's potential that planes are going to fall from the sky, and it's not just planes, it's helicopters too. They use these altimeters for determining their altitude from terrain. And so it's been a really difficult conversation to have, because there is really no evidence of harm, and you have this threat to consumer livelihoods and safety, not only in the air but also on the ground. That's really problematic. To me it's a breakdown of the process, and needs to be addressed in my mind cohesively, and I'm not sure it's going to be.
Yeah, a good summary. I mean, we could almost spend I think the full half hour or so on this issue. So, but we can't. But my final one would be, let me just ask Philip: have you had any issue with this, or was there any consideration about this type of thing in your dealings and looking, identifying and allocating the spectrum for this industry?
So to us, for example, we've got the entire band from 3.4 to 3.8, which we've allocated for mobile and high-power mobile. The 3.8 to 4.2 is being used for fixed links and other services and fixed wireless applications for an awful long time. And there's been no particular challenges anyone's ever recognized. I think one of the key challenges in any spectrum management decisions is always understanding what the interference is. And I've always found the incumbents are always worried that whatever's going to happen is going to cause them a problem. And actually, you need to get some real world figures to try and figure this sort of stuff out, not just sort of do theoretical modeling all the time and try and figure out and actually understand what's happening. And, you know, we spend all our lives looking at this sort of stuff, whether it's in our own national bits or in the international bodies. You know, Mike will remember at the last WRC, we spent ages talking about satellites at the 24 gig boundary causing problems to various things. And, you know, you've got to put what's in place. But to your question before, I mean, I think some of the stuff for this is all industries are digitizing, and therefore using wireless and using radio as a way of helping that as the industrial scenery changes is important. Do you need to allocate it to a particular industry? I actually struggle to see why you do in many cases, because many industries are in different places. You know, of course, at the port, you've got all the things that go in harbour operations. People need stuff there. But you don't have other people at the same place saying, I need my bit. You can actually work it out of how you do it. If you've got sufficient spectrum, you've got the solution at those particular places. If you come into our cities, we've got office blocks and business parks. We've got people who need different solutions. We've got factories next to them. So you don't need to give a massive big block of spectrum for somebody who's going to use it at a particular place, which is why we've taken an approach of allocating it to the industry at the point it needs it, not across a wider area. So, you know, whether you do it by databases or other systems, it's the tool you need at the point. So I think for me, it's actually understanding what the problem is for all industry, how much they need, and giving to them at the point they need it to enable it to work in the way they need to encourage everybody to be able to use new wireless technologies to take advantage of it, to actually make sure that all of our industrial processes enhance and go forward.
Okay.
Chris, if I could quickly jump in on that, I was just going to add, I think that, you know, both Mike and Philip have made a good point here about if you do allocate for a specific, you know, industry or vertical or what, you know, ever, you're inherently limiting the size of the ecosystem that can form around that band, right? I mean, you're saying, okay, it's just for manufacturing, or it's, you know, just for wireless broadcast or whatever. You know, if you take an approach like, you know, Philip has done with 3842 in the UK, or we have with CBRS, you say it's, yeah, essentially just about open to everyone, then, you know, it creates a much more vibrant ecosystem, both in terms of the infrastructure equipment, the client equipment, the integrators. You know, with CBRS, we've even allowed, you know, public access, so the mobile operators are there. They drive, you know, tremendous volumes on the client side and uptake in mobile handsets. So, you know, which again leads to chipsets, and, you know, the price points may not be as important in manufacturing, but, you know, for a lot of the other verticals that are looking to deploy private LTE and private 5G, you know, price points are an issue. So the broader the ecosystem, the better the economics.
Exactly.
Well, Dave, I'm going to put this one to you, but I am going to go through all the panelists because I think it's a key question. Okay, and I could probably guess maybe what your answer is, but what should the balance be? I mean, how do governments that are charged of this really important natural resource, it's limited in supply, you know, what should they be considering when it's licensed? You know, looking at either license, or making it unlicensed, or doing a shared model, whether it's like CBRS or some other model that we don't even have thought of right now. How you know, what should the governments be considering? What are the key factors?
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, low, mid, high band, right? It's probably different in when we talk about different frequency ranges, right? Low, to my mind, you know, I think you almost have to inherently favor licensing low band frequencies, because it's typically going to be used, you know, for national level or, you know, very large regional area coverage. You know, yes, there are some, you know, unlicensed allegations sub 1 gigahertz, but you know, I think those are, you know, the exception rather than the rule. I don't necessarily like the term balance. I think it implies, you know, you can have even, you know, allocations among these various regimes. I prefer to talk about a comprehensive spectrum approach, because I think that, again, yeah, it's going to vary. It's going to vary by frequency range. It's going to vary by country and by use case. But, you know, to my mind, you know, we've had licensed and license exempt, unlicensed, whatever you call it in the country you happen to be in, for 20, 30 years now. And those are well established. They've led to everything we know today with the mobile network, you know, cellular industry, as well as the, you know, call it consumer enterprise Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, industries. And both of those, in my mind, are hugely important to, how life happens in 2021. I wouldn't want to envision life without Wi-Fi or without LTE and soon 5G. So, they're all important. What CBRS and these shared spectrum, even the local licensing approaches that, we're seeing like in UK and other parts of Europe, I think what they represent is just a new approach. And what this, it's a new tool in the toolkit for, policymakers and regulators. With CBRS, with the dynamic coordination we have, it actually allows you to kind of mix and match the protected rights with the opportunistic rights, and those can flex over time and they can flex by geography. So I think, to my mind, it's incredibly important that we prove this model out, because it's not going to be any easier going forward to find mid or low band spectrum. It's going to just become increasingly harder. And if we're going to share with incumbents, database technologies are going to be very important to making that, happen, and to making the most efficient use of that precious resource that you talked about. But bottom line, I think we need licensed, unlicensed, and we need these new sharing frequencies, particularly in the mid bands.
Okay, great. And I have follow-up questions, but I want to get to other panelists as well. So let me go to Mike. Mike, kind of go back to my question though of, what's the balance that governments have to kind of consider when they're looking at licensed, unlicensed, or share? What's going through your mind, or what should they be doing maybe?
Look, at the answer is more for everyone.
More
and that's
for
hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to do, but you want all three. Dave did a great, description of what's in play, the three different models, and I want more for each. We need more mid-band spectrum for licensed users. We need more for in the shared model, and from the shared you can get more unlicensed, or maybe you do what we did in 6 gigahertz and have 1200 megahertz for an unlicensed panoply. A really good oasis for those options. So I don't, there was this conversation passed before that anytime you did some licensed spectrum, you had to have a piece of it had to go to unlicensed. And I thought that was the wrong model. You really focus on what you have based on the band and what you can do with it. I look at lower 3 gigahertz in the United States, for instance, and I say, here's a great opportunity. We're able to get 100 megahertz out for licensed. We should be able to get another 100 out for licensed. And then the rest can be done in a sharing structure, which still allows for unlicensed opportunities as part of the GAA formulation. So I think the model can work in certain places. It's not a solution for everything, but all three have to get more. And what that means is, it means that our federal users in the United States, which are really big holders, they're going to have to give up more, and that's really hard to do. Philosophically, it's not. Intellectually, it's not. But actually making it happen is really difficult, and that's the lifting that I used to do at the commission. I do some of it from the outside, and policymakers are going to have to do. We're going to need to reduce the spectrum holdings of federal users to be able to address all of the needs that are going forward as wireless continues to take off.
All right. Okay, Philip, I'm going to let you bring this question home before I move on. What should governments be looking at when they're trying to figure out license, unlicensed, and or should?
To be honest, you need to make sure the spectrum's available for everybody. You need to make sure it's available for full national coverage. It's available for people who need to do enterprise. It's available for license exempt use in your homes. We need to get the right balance. There isn't a single answer. Sometimes, as Mike's just said, there's some bands where there's some incumbents in it. You can't clear it all. So maybe it's ideal to be able to use that at a more local level so you can make optimum use of it. There's some bits where you can clear it, and therefore it's good for a national level. As Dave was saying, low, medium, and high, we need to make sure we've got the right balance and the right thing. The one thing we shouldn't do is assume that we know better than the market does of how people should acquire spectrum. So we shouldn't say the only way you can get 5G spectrum or XG spectrum is to get it through this group of people. We need to make sure that the market can decide whether they get spectrum, which is license exempt, light licensed, or whatever other name shared you want, and then national license to enable things to happen. And therefore make sure we get the balance right between all of those, to be honest.
Okay, so here's a lightning round question. It's only one of the lightning round, though. I'm going to ask you first, and I'll go down the list, and you have to say yes or no. Two choices, yes or no. So we just talked about all these allocation processes, what government should do. So the industry that I represent, mobile communications, loves internationally harmonized wireless spectrum. And if you look at the auctions, they've set records in almost every single country over time, whether it's in the last 2 years or 10, 20 years ago. There's always a record because of this type of spectrum. Yes or no, should it matter to in the decision-making process of governments, whether this spectrum is going to be valued by one entity or industry or not. So it doesn't matter that you're going to make a lot of money for your treasury. Yes or no? I'll start with Philip.
No.
No.
Mike.
No.
And no. Okay. Interesting. All right. Good to hear. So one of the things that we talked about was the idea that in all your three of your answers a minute ago was about incumbents and the challenges incumbents. So let me start with Mike. You kind of mentioned it a little bit in a few of your answers. Where do you see the pipeline of spectrum coming? And probably I would ask you pretty much for the United States, unless you want to expand to other areas, but where do you see the pipeline coming down for the industry, and then also how that, it'd be 5G and manufacturing, all those type of, where's the spectrum going to come from? We just had a big chunk of C-band. We have 3.45 being auctioned right now, and I have to be careful what I say, I guess. But it's where's the next round or where's the next load of spectrum?
Well, I think it's lower 3 gigahertz, 3.1 to 3.45. I think it's 7 and 8. It's some of the high bands that have already been allocated, probably more high bands to fit the portfolio that Dave talked about, the 3 different tiers and 3 different, cake as people like to make it as a formulation of a cake. So I think it's all those. That's what I have in my portfolio. But I ask the question is, what's after that? Those are what's being talked about today. What's the next, 3 or 4 in the United States? And that's where everyone starts shaking their head.
Yeah. All right. Dave, any thoughts on where the spectrum coming, and maybe for you, whether that would be shared spectrum because there's so many incumbents?
Well, I'm going to just in the U.S. I'm going to agree with Mike. I think it's 3100 to 3450, and then 7125 up to about 8400 are the kind of near-term ones. After that, I agree. We're kind of all looking at each other, going, okay, I know there's some talk about 12 gigahertz. That may be the kind of in the mix as well. I think internationally, 3.8 to 4.2. I think Philip set some good precedent there in the UK. We've now got a number of other countries opening that up on a local licensing basis. South America, Middle East, and then both RSPG, and now there's a draft European Commission encouraging 3.8 to 4.2 for industrial manufacturing. So I think we'll see a lot more activity around 3.8 to 4.2 globally. Aligns nicely with what we're doing here with C-band, of course, ecosystem economics. So yeah, I think those are the ones I'm looking at most closely.
And Philip, I'm not sure what you can disclose from your position, but
I'm actually going to have a slightly different view than the others. So to be honest, I think one of the things you've got to take about is I look after spectrum, not just for a particular industry, but for everybody. And you've got to realize that other people need spectrum as opposed to the enterprises or the mobile operators or other things going through. So how do you make the needs of everybody as opposed to the needs of one group of people? I think the other challenge for us, particularly in the mobile industry, is that we tended to think quite a lot about how networks were built in a day of voice. And therefore, as we go more and more and more to data, the way networks need to be built becomes differently. We've got loads of spectrum in the high frequencies and millimetric wave bands. The more you need now to get more capacity at the more local level and the more things you do it, you need to understand how you build the national coverage, how you build the more local coverage, and then how you build the micro coverage. And I think we need to think about how you change the network design to make use of more efficiency of it before we just load it upon the same concept of building networks in the way we've always done. And I think people need to think about that sort of stuff, as well as where we find more spectrum in different parts of the bands.
Okay, I have a question from the audience, and this is going to be directed to Mike and also Philip. And it is, when the government decides to dedicate spectrum specifically to an enterprise, what are the considerations around taking business possibly from a wireless operator? I'll start with you, Mike.
Yeah, this is the problem. We've moved away from this model where, and we've had the tension in the United States for certainly as 5G is exploded, is who's in control, right? And many of the sectors that we talked about in power, automotive, they didn't, they previously had spectrum, and they didn't want to lose control of that and have an operator in play as part of the equation. But we're finding that as we moved forward, we couldn't do that model anymore, and it didn't make much sense. And so now we're finding the partnerships between operators and enterprises and sectors that is much more valuable, much more conducive to sound spectrum policy. And so I think we've solved some of those issues, and there has to be a partnership. That the operators are not going to be ignored. That the sectors are not going to take over and eliminate operators, as they maybe once thought.
Yeah. Philip, what's your thoughts? If you do a,
to be honest, it's competition. Yeah, if you want to go and buy the stuff from a mobile operator who provide a good service to you and do it, then you should. If you want to go and get it from a system integrator who works the mobile operator, then you should. If you want to be able to get your own spectrum and be able to get the stuff at the local level for particular reasons of control or your own enterprise, then you should as well. So I think this is part of how the market should decide. And we shouldn't decide how people should actually buy things. What we should do is make sure that spectrum's available, optimum and used to make sure that people can actually use it in the way that's right for them.
yeah, I think the question though, I guess, Philip, I'll follow up with you on that one is, if you dedicate it to an enterprise, a lot of times you have less bidders, right?
No, but in our case, we're dedicating it, but we're not letting it to bid. So for example, at the place of where you are, say you happen to be in Seattle somewhere and happen to have a place where you've got your own business park in Seattle.
Right.
You say, I want the bit of spectrum in this place. Actually, there's probably nobody else who needs it there. There might be a few other people in the building, and I'm looking to see how I get in 3 dimensions.
Right.
But the question for me is, I can make spectrum available for you there without causing a problem to someone else. But a mobile operator who's got a more national license could also make it available to you. So it's for you to decide what you should get and how you should get it. And I've done it in a way that's not taking it away from somebody else, and you're therefore deciding how to do it. And to the point we were asking before, if there's a band, as Mike was saying, some bands where it's used by federal users in the States, and you can only use it in patches, then it's fantastic. You can use it for these sort of applications, and then you're making the decision of how you want to buy it. I'm not deciding for you. You can only buy it from company X.
Yeah.
I think to Dave's, what CBRS allows that to happen. So I think I didn't mean to suggest that we aren't going to have that. And he mentioned a number of bidders that won licenses that were, particular sectors. And so I think you can have both. But as a whole overall policy, you're going to move away the idea that certain sectors are going to have their own bailiwicks.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what we want to make sure that it's a fair playing field, and if you can get spectrum at 1/10 the price than an operator has, then people start to say, well, wait a sec, are you doing something here that isn't valuing the spectrum at the right price? Dave, what are your thoughts?
Sorry, but don't forget, the operator tends to have it right across the nation or across the region, whereas the enterprise tends to have it at point A.
Right. Yeah.
And there may be other encumbrances, like with CBRS, we have obviously, preemption, requirements, or so yeah.
Yeah. Well,
not apples and apples on the licenses.
Right. Exactly. Well, that's what I was going to ask you, Dave, about, when we talk about spectrum, and really gets back to that last question. We saw CBRS, and it's been I would say, a success. And we have a lot of private enterprise. We have manufacturing. We have a kind of a sharing license model that's doing very well, I would say. I mean, in general. But people would also say, well, but CBRS wasn't valued at the same value like a C-band. And should that matter, or is that the type of getting to the question, is that really a good thing?
Yeah, well, you kind of skipped me when you asked the lightning round question of whether the revenue to the Treasury was the yes or no.
I thought I heard you. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to agree that it's if that's the metric, then no, that's not important. What's really important is sort of the overall GDP contribution. And so I think what you want to look at is so CBRS, we raised about 5 billion. And C-band raised 80 billion, right. not including the accelerated clearing costs or payments, I should say. But then look at the participation rate. So C-band is approximately 20 bidders, and I think 8 or 9 essentially secured licenses. Right, with the CBRS PAL auction, we had 228 entities that secured licenses. I mean, it was the most widely participated in auction by far that the commission has ever had. So I think it all depends on what metrics you want to look at. I think the CBRS auction was a wonderful precedent for what you can do with essentially relatively localized licenses that are open for a variety of use cases to all comers.
Yeah. Well, I think it was a great way to end the panel. I can't believe it went so fast. And so we'll give let Dave had the last word, but I'd like to say thank you very much, Dave. Apologies, I thought you said already answered that lightning round question, but thanks, Dave, and thanks former Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. And remember, he's with now has his own firm, and So give him some business. And also thank you, Philip, for giving us your viewpoint on the world, really, and where you're coming from Ofcom. So again, a big thanks to the three panelists, and we look forward to having everyone participate in the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.